We have the brand new Winspace SLC version 3 frame set in a size 56/large paired to these brand new Winspace Loon Hyper D45 wheels weighing in at 6.7 kilograms. And this is in a 1x configuration. Does not include pedals, power meter, does not include bottle cage, but it does include an out front mount. And again, guys, 1x 6.7 kilograms.
Yo, welcome back to the channel, boys and girls. In today's video, we are taking a look at my brand new Winspace SLC version 3 frame set because, as you guys can see, my bike build is finally finished. So of course, we are going to be talking about the specs and the builds of this SLC version 3. Naturally, we are going to be talking about these wheels. These are brand new from Winspace. This is their Hyper 3 generation of wheels. And then we're going to be taking this bike out on the road so I can give you some of my thoughts on this build now that I've ridden about almost 400 miles so far. But I will say, as a spoiler alert, that this bike is so good and it's so refined that I might actually end up selling my Winspace T1500 frame set that I've had for about 3 years now, because this bike is just that good. So without further ado, let's begin. So first things first, let's go ahead and talk about these wheels that you see here. So these are actually brand new from Winspace this season. This is their Hyper 3 generation line of wheels. Particularly, this is their D45 set of wheels. Now, as you guys can see by looking on this frame, it's basically a staggered setup. So you have 46 millimeters in the front, 54 millimeters in the rear. One of the key marks on this new generation of wheels is Winspace has finally moved to 23 millimeters internal as far as the width goes, which is nice because essentially what that does is that will plump up your 28C tires to around 30 millimeters at the rim. And then another key defining detail on these wheels is Winspace is using their next generation of wide carbon spokes. So these spokes are a little bit wider than the previous 2 generations of Hyper wheels. Of course, you still get ceramic bearings. You now also get a star ratchet system. It's a 36 tooth star ratchet engagement system versus the 4 or 5 paw design in the first 2 generations of Hypers. And then the biggest shocker here is going to be the price tag. So at the time of this video, the retail price on these is $1,700 USD. That is not cheap at all. And even though I do have a code which should give you, I believe, 10% off your purchase from Winspace, $1,700 is pretty expensive. There's really no way around it. And even though Winspace has made these changes to these wheels to make them updated and more modern, it's going to be a very difficult price for customers to go ahead with. But nonetheless, that is the price on these wheels. Very superstitious writings on the wall. You guys know what time it is, but before we weigh out these wheels, huge shout out to Stevie Wonder with the LP, The Talking Book, with such classic songs as, you guessed it, Superstitious. The advertised weight on these D45s is around 1334 grams, plus or minus 15 grams. And we are using the SRAM XDR free hub. All right, so for the front, or excuse me, this is for the rear wheel, we have 756 grams. You guys see that? 756 grams. And then for the front wheel, we have it is 604 grams. 604 grams. So that gives us a grand total of 1,360 grams. So if you do the math, what is that? 1334 plus 15. That should be like 1350-ish. So a little bit overweight, but when it comes to these Chinese brands, we've all come to expect that whatever their advertised claim weight is, it's always completely understated and it's going to be several grams over. But anyway, let's continue. Now, going back to the frame itself, like I said in the introduction of this video, this is Winspace's brand new SLC version 3 climbing frame set. Now, what's interesting about this frame is, according to Winspace's press release, is they were trying to update this frame set to compete with the likes of a Tarmac SL8. I don't necessarily agree with this option. I think a better comparison is probably more of the Specialized Athos, but essentially what they did with this frame is they moved everything to fully internal cable routing. So no more routing the cables for the front brake through the fork. Everything is fully internal. They've kind of extended the length on the head tube to make it a little bit more aerodynamic. You still get the 27 point, I forgot what it is, 27.4. I'll put it on the screen, but you still get the round seat post, which is nice because you'll be able to upgrade the seat post if you like. If you happen to crash your bike for whatever reason and you need to replace that seat post, it's going to be very easy to find replacements in your local shop. But overall, the overall aesthetics on this in this matte black, it looks very good. It looks very classic. Another interesting point that Winspace has said is they wanted to make this more of their all-around frame set, which is an interesting decision to make because they do have their Winspace Agile frame, which is supposed to also be their all-around frame. I think what Winspace probably could do, and I think what customers would appreciate, is if they just stick to the climbing bike with the SLC, as well as their all-out aero bike with their Winspace T1550. But nonetheless, this is how they market it. The bike looks fantastic in my opinion, and I really like the amazing classic aesthetics of this frame set. Now, as far as sizing goes, I selected a size large/56. For reference, I'm about 6 feet tall. My saddle to bottom bracket height is around like 77.5 centimeters. And then as far as my handlebar selection, I went with 38 centimeter width bars. And then as far as the stem length on these bars, it's 125 millimeters. But keep in mind that if you are deciding to go with an integrated cockpit from any of these Chinese brands, just know that the overall effective reach on these one-piece integrated cockpit, it will be slightly longer than the advertised specs on the website. Now, speaking of handlebars, these handlebars, of course, are from Winspace. This is their Zero one-piece cockpit, as I've mentioned before. In my opinion, Winspace makes some of the best integrated cockpits on the market, or at least as far as the one-piece handlebars that I've tested so far on this channel. And that even includes the brand new EXS handlebars that I have just listed on my channel. I'll post a link somewhere in this video. I just put those EXS handlebars on my Specialized SL8. But Winspace makes fantastic handlebars in terms of just the ergonomics, the road feel, the stiffness on them. Everything just is really easy to route the cables. Even the exit ports on the handlebars, when it comes to plugging up the hydraulic cables to the shift levers, they are in the right place. Something that I actually have a point of criticism on my EXS handlebars, but nonetheless, I've been using these bars even on my Winspace T1500 frame set. And even if I was not riding any actual frames from Winspace, I think I would still make a purchase of these handlebars from Winspace because they are really just that good.
Let's go ahead and do a real-world weight test where we have this bike set up as a true climbing build. And what I mean by that is, as you guys can see, we have a 2x setup, SRAM Force ETAP Generation 1. And this is going to include the pedals, is going to include, of course, the 2 chain rings, the spider-based power meter, the front derailleur, extra battery, meaning that's going to be, of course, extra weight. We even have a bottle cage installed, the out front mount, and then I went ahead and swapped out the saddle. This is a Bontrager saddle. It's actually much more comfortable than that fully carbon one, but this saddle is 100 grams heavier than that fully carbon one. But this gives us a grand total for this climbing build, 7.5 kilograms. I'll put somewhere on the screen what that is in pounds, but 7.5 kilograms for a fully out the door, ready to ride climbers build setup for this Winspace SLC version 3.
Next up, let's talk about my drivetrain. So as you guys can see, I went with a SRAM Force Generation 1 Axis ETAP system. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I went with this drivetrain choice. So number one is, if you are a savvy shopper on the internet these days, you can typically find a pretty good deal on the first generation of the SRAM Force ETAP group set, and that's why I went with that. The second reason is because I'm constantly building up new frames all the time throughout the year, setting up a bike with SRAM ETAP is ridiculously easy. In fact, it used to take me maybe a day or two to set up these bikes, and now with SRAM ETAP, because everything is wireless and everything is modular, I can basically build the bike now in about 4 to 5 hours, and that includes bleeding the brakes. Now, as far as the actual drivetrain itself, out back we have an 10-28 cassette. And then as far as the chainring, we have a 48/35 setup for the chainring. Of course, we have a SRAM/Cork spider-based power meter. As far as the rotors go, these are the SRAM red rotors. My apologies for the plane overhead. As far as rotors go, we have a 160 in the front and then a 140 in the rear. Now, the interesting thing with SRAM is because for their general chainring, because it is a 48/35, that does enable me to use a 10-28 out back versus like a 11-30 or like 11-33, and that should still give me all the range I need for, I would say, anywhere within 3 hours of riding here in Chicagoland. They really don't have too many hills that really go above maybe like 10%, and even with that, I'll have plenty of range with this setup. And this is also why I decided to change this to a 2x setup versus the 1x setup. Of course, the 1x setup is going to be the lightest, but the reality is this is a climbing bike, and the intent for this bike is to use this in areas where I would be doing a lot of climbing or at least a lot of rolling hills. And if I was living in a place permanently that had a lot of climbs, I just don't think that a 1x system would make a lot of sense for me. I still think that the 2x setup is the most optimal, even if there is a little bit of an extra weight penalty. And speaking of weight, as you guys can see, I've actually swapped out the saddle. The original saddle that I had on here when I first built this up was an AliExpress special. It was fully carbon. It weighed like 97 grams. This one now that you see is from Trek. It's from a Bontrager line. This is their Aeolus saddle. I really like the saddle a lot. In fact, once I swapped this saddle on from the previous AliExpress, I immediately remembered how comfortable this saddle was. In fact, this is the saddle that I was running on my Winspace T1500 frame set, and it just works for my body type perfectly. And especially on a build like this, when you're doing a lot of climbing, the assumption is if you are in an area with a lot of climbs, you probably are going to be doing longer days out in the saddle. And this saddle is very, very comfortable. And even though it does weigh 225 grams, which, I mean, it's not really that heavy, for this setup, I'm going to for sure be prioritizing comfort versus just having this super weight weenie build that just basically is going to be impractical for everyday living, for at least the areas that I ride my bike. The mosquitoes are eating me alive today. Hey, I guess they like dark meat. But anyway, let's talk about just a couple of the other tidbits on this bike before we take this out on the road so I can give you some of my thoughts on it. First off, Supercast bar tape. I've been using this on all of my builds. They're really grippy even when it's wet. They're usually pretty affordable. You can find them on sale. So I always like running Supercast bar tape. As far as tires goes, we are using my Continental GP5000s and the 28C size. Like I said earlier in this video, on these wheels, they pump up the 28C tires to about 30 millimeters at the rim. TPU inner tubes, of course, because they are pretty resistant to punctures and they are a little bit lighter in weight. As far as pedal goes, we are using the first generation of the Look Keo Blade pedals. Bottle cages are my tried and true Tex bottle cages. I think they're like polycarbonate, something like that. You can get them for about 25 bucks on Amazon. Free hub sound test on these Winspace Loon Hyper 3 D45 wheels with the 36 tooth star ratchet engagement. So let's continue. Let's go ahead and take this bike out on the road so I can give you some of my thoughts about how this bike has been in the last 400 miles or so. Yo guys, check out my brand new 3D printed helmet from Cav. I will be having a video on this helmet coming out in the upcoming weeks. As you guys can see, the color I went with is phallic pink. First things first, let's talk about the giant elephant in the room. Is this Winspace SLC version 3 similar in ride dynamics to my Tarmac SL8 Pro? And the short answer is no. Not really at all. And I think for Winspace's sake, I think if they were to change the marketing aspects from this frame set, from it basically being a bike that is trying to compete with the Tarmac SL8, and instead, if they just went along the lines of saying, hey, this is our modern day take on a climbing bike, we've decided to add some aerodynamic features to this frame set. I think as far as sales goes and just sort of the overall theme for this frame set, I think that Winspace will have a better way to position this bike in their lineup of frames. The thing with the Tarmac SL8 Pro, or even just the Tarmac in general, is Specialized has found an uncanny way to balance out speed, comfort, and stiffness on that frame set in such a way that I just have not been able to find in the more affordable options, especially from the Chinese on the market today. And that's something that you probably should expect, because that Tarmac SL8 frame set does cost $3,500 as opposed to this only costing $2,000. So although this Winspace SLC version 3 frame set does not have the overall sense of speed and immediacy as the Tarmac SL8 does, let's talk about all the things that this bike does very well, because there are a lot of things. So first things first, this bike definitely feels stiff. It definitely feels responsive. It definitely is comfortable as well. It just does not really do those things in a way that the Tarmac SL8 does. Now again, I keep bringing up the SL8 is because this is the way that Winspace is marketing that frame. As far as a climbing bike goes, I think this is going to be closer to something like a Specialized Athos, which I believe I might actually be able to get a loaner bike of the Athos that I'll be able to test that bike out with this. But as far as the areas where this bike really needs to be stiff, which is in the head tube and the bottom bracket, this bike, or this frame as a whole, as an entire package, it does a fantastic job. There's no doubt about that. It really feels comfortable when you are out of the saddle, when you're putting down the power, when you are going up any sort of inclines or climbs. This bike does a really good job with that as well. As far as stiffness goes, this is kind of what surprised me. Is, like I said, this bike is stiff, but stiff in relation to comfort. I find that this bike is stiff, but it is more comfortable than my Winspace T1500 frame set. Of course, that should be expected given the design of this frame. You have the traditional round seat post, but I find this bike to be very comfortable. It's not comfortable in the way of the Tarmac SL8, but overall it's a very comfortable ride. The handling on this bike is another thing that really surprised me with this frame set. This bike handles really well. When you are descending, you definitely feel like you have a lot of control. It doesn't get upset in the rear end. Now, this is something that I've talked about in some of my other videos when it comes to the sub $1,000 Chinese frame set. This bike does not get disrupted over rough pavement at all. In fact, this bike is probably the most refined bike that I've tested from Winspace. It definitely feels more overall refined than my T1500 frame set. That is more of a race bike, but Winspace did a fantastic job with the ride dynamics of this bike. Everything just feels perfect with respects to the price. Just the way the handlebars feel, everything feels locked in. It feels right in place. As soon as you hop on this bike, you feel right away how everything is working harmoniously together to give you this feeling out on the road that it's very subtle, but it just feels very refined. It's not going to have the immediacy and speed, like I've said, as something that's more of a traditional aero framed bike, but just as an all-arounder, which is kind of ironic for me to say, but just more of an all-around feel of how this bike feels. This definitely is the most balanced frame from Winspace that I have tested so far on this channel. Interesting thing is, when it comes to the handlebars and it comes to the saddle and the pedals, all of those things I have swapped off of my Winspace T1500 frame set, so that at least gives me a little bit of a reference point. The only thing that's slightly different is, even though I was also using hyper wheels on that frame set, these ones are a little bit more shallow in depth, of course. But speaking of speed compared to this versus a traditional aero bike, if you are someone that likes the aesthetics of this climbing bike, you like the comforts and the characteristics that a climbing aero bike brings, if you do need more speed, you could just slap on some deeper depth hyper wheels, which is exactly what I plan to do. I do have some rides coming up planned with this frame, and I do just like to have that faster sense of speed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap out these wheels, these D45 wheels, and I'm going to put on my Generation 2 D67 wheels. Will that make this bike look a little bit unproportioned because you're going to have these super deep 68 and 60 depth wheels on a climbing bike? It probably will, but I think that's just the fun of having a frame like this. If you want something that's a little bit lighter, you can just put on some climbing wheels like these or some all-around wheels. And then if you're going to be somewhere where it's going to be flat, you're not going to be doing a lot of accelerating, that's where those hyper D67 wheels, whether it's the Generation 2 or the Generation 3 line of wheels, are going to come in handy. And I think that's even just going to offer more speed and it's not going to disrupt this frame set in any way. So is this bike stiff? Absolutely. Is this bike comfortable? Yes, it is. Is this bike refined? Yes, it's the most refined bike that I have tested from Winspace. The one area that it is going to struggle with, and again, you can always mitigate that with some deeper depth wheels, is just going to be the speed. And like I said earlier in this video, I think for Winspace's sake, I think they would be better off just marketing this frame as their new and modern take on a climbing bike versus trying to have this compete with something like a Specialized Tarmac SL8. But overall, all in all, this is a fantastic bike. I'm actually surprised how much I like it. And like I said, I think I'm going to end up selling my T1500 frame set because I just feel so locked in on this bike. And if I truly wanted that extra oomph from speed, I can always slap on some Winspace Hyper D67 wheels. So that is going to wrap up today's video, guys. Huge shout out to Winspace for sending me out this frame set as well as these matching wheels to try out. I'm really excited for this build. The overall ride feeling of this is very, very refined. In fact, it's more refined than my Winspace T1500 Aero frame set. Granted, that is more of a race bike and this is more of a climbing bike, but just the overall fit and finish on this bike, it's really, really good despite the price tag for what it is. But overall, what you get as far as the feeling on it, on paper, out on the road, this bike is fantastic. So as always, guys, questions, comments, and concerns, please feel free to leave them down below, and I'm gonna check you guys on the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.